I need support staff to clear the room. Stand up and walk, now.
Hello and welcome to The Watch. My name is Chris Ryan. I'm an editor at TheRinger.com, and joining me in the studio, he just got off his shift from the hi-hat. It's Andy Greenwald! Woo! How you doing?
For a second, I left my body.
Did you really?
Yeah. I was like, what's the hi-hat?
It's the
It's
bar.
the bar and the Deuce, the show we're going to talk
Which is
about.
the show we're talking about today. Today is also Book Club Day.
Today
is Pelecanos Day is what it is.
It's Pelecanos season.
So today, Andy and I are going to talk a little bit about The Deuce, the show that's been running for the last 6 weeks on HBO.
Yep.
We did an interview with the show's co-creator, George Pelecanos, a few weeks ago, so you guys should definitely check that out if you want to get a deep dive on the sort of the creation, the behind the scenes of the show. Today, we're going to talk about a few of the episodes and just how we think it's going, but because George Pelecanos is the co-creator of The Deuce, and he's also the author of our book club book this era, or this age.
Yeah, this month.
The Sweet Forever.
Yeah.
We're going to kind of combine the two topics together to kind of just talk about crime fiction, crime television shows.
His particular set of skills.
Yes, his particular set of skills. We are going to be joined for the book club portion of this by a DC legend, another DC legend, Joe House.
I thought you were going to say Otto Porter.
Calling in. So we'll talk to Joe about the book. I don't know if Joe's seen The Deuce, but we'll be talking. Sweet Forever set in DC.
It's set in the 80s in DC. It's about, as much as anything, it's about that city. It's about that the dawn of the crack era in DC. It's about Len Bias, local star. It bookended by his time in the tournament that year in 1986, and then his death right after the draft.
And is obviously very informed by the music that was going on around at that time. 86 was a very good year.
Here's my goal. I'm going to set out a goal. It's always risky to set out a goal at the beginning of a podcast, an unplanned podcast. But we are going to talk about The Deuce. If you have not yet read The Sweet Forever, I still think you'll find things worth listening to in the second half of the show, because we are not specifically going to spoil the book per se. It's not really spoilable in a lot of ways. And what I hope we get out of our conversation with House is really context for the book, for
what it was like in DC in the 80s.
For the city, and then how the city has changed. And also, through that conversation, it's another way into why we love books like this and why we really hope people love exploring these books with us. And I have to say, that same love, it was a really interesting week to catch up on The Deuce and then read The Sweet Forever for the third time, and made me, first of all, it was very pleasurable, both experiences, but also really exciting to be able to just in the moment track and visualize the connections between Pelecanos' work and see that the things that made me fall in love with him as a writer are still present in his work on the small screen.
Well, one of the things that's fascinating is how Pelecanos, and he talked about this in his interview with us, like a lot of authors, was like largely a fringe figure, was just kind of plugging away at crime novels and hoping for something to pop. And I think with a lot of crime novelists, what happens is, if they don't get acclaim immediately, they kind of just build their audience book after book. And these guys are prolific. They usually pump out a book like once every 18 to 24 months.
Yep.
And, he was somebody who really believed in what he was doing early on. And that was this idea that the crime is ancillary to the life of the people who are affected by the crime. And the crime story can take in everything from politics to music to friendship to drug abuse to all these different things that you want to talk about. You can do it through the lens of having a crime. In the years since George wrote Sweet Forever, that became a popular television trope.
Yes, and I'm glad you said that and made that turn, because what I really took away from this week catching up on The Deuce and reading this book is that one of the things that George brings to his work that is so essential and so missing from a lot of the television that we sift through is a real sense of light amidst the dark. And what I mean is, The Deuce is not by any stretch a feel-good TV show. It traffics in, maybe that's a poor choice of words, a lot of the darker elements of humanity. It is about the sex trade. There is enormous misogyny, and there's violence, and there's fear, and there's a dark side of race at play in a lot of this. And of course, because it's Pelecanos and his co-creator David Simon, the show doesn't shy away from any of it. But there's also the hi-hat, which is the bar that you mentioned, that James Franco's character, one of his characters, his better character, I would say, Vincent, is opening and managing. And it is a port in the storm.
Yeah.
And my biggest surprise from watching these last few episodes of The Deuce, which I completely adored, I think this is outstanding television. Every time an episode ended, I missed it. I missed the world. I don't necessarily want to live on Times Square in 1972. I don't really know what my hustle would be. I don't think I would be good at having a hustle then or now. But there is something about the life of this bar, and there's something that is just good about this virtue. It's virtuous almost. This idea that, and it's said verbatim by one of the characters, everyone needs a place to drink at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And in every Pelecanos book, there's always a bar. In his earlier books, starring Nick Stefanos, who is a character in The Sweet Forever, a supporting character, Nick picks up shifts at a bar called The Spot. And the way that the Pelecanos evokes this place, there's raging violence and uncertainty, and of course the inner turmoil of our first-person narrator. But in this place, where you can always pour a couple fingers of old granddad, and you can crack a beer, and different walks of life come in there. And in that one place you are together. That is sort of the linchpin of the show, of the Deuce. And TV needs that. TV needs it. I'm a broken record about this. But you kind of want to spend time with people.
Yeah.
That's what TV is. And so the fact that they have found a way to articulate that so well, and that was in The Wire, and that was in Treme, but it's the heart of the show, at least through 6 episodes, in a way that surprised me and has really sustained my love for it.
It's interesting to go through this coming out of the summer and into the fall, where we've talked about Westworld and we've talked about Game of Thrones. And those two shows, while they're very different in terms of their mythology and quality, both had a feeling of, as we were watching it, we were trying to solve it. That there was a degree to which you were almost getting ahead of your skis because you were trying to get to the... I understand how this is, and a lot of the time it wouldn't necessarily be that you were trying to get to the end because you were trying to spoil it for yourself as much as you were trying to borrow a David Simonism, make all the pieces matter. You wanted everything that you were seeing to be going towards an ultimate answer.
Or else why is this journey worth it?
Sure. Watching The Deuce has been a nice reminder that there is a multiplicity of television experiences, and one's not necessarily better than the other, but the idea of a hangout show, even a hangout show that is about topics and subject matter that you wouldn't necessarily want to hang out in. Like you're saying, like after watching this, it's not like you are pining for the days of 1970s
peep shows and
Times Square. Yeah.
Rousts.
But the idea that, to say that this is a tapestry is to like kind of, it's underselling the size of the cast here. It's
shit on tapestries.
It's and I think sometimes it works against the show in terms of the drama, in terms of the, heightened sensory experience you might want to get from a television show when you're watching is simply so much stuff to pay attention to that you can kind of just immerse yourself in it. But to watch them put together this ensemble and to just slowly kind of unravel this story and even though there are so many huge sociocultural moments that are getting touched on in this show, they're just kind of like... They're kind of surfing it, man. They're just kind of like just letting it happen. And God bless them like for being allowed to do this still. Like that there are still shows that can be this.
Well, here's the thing. Like this is what separates a Simon show or a Simon and Pelecanos show from a lot of other things that were foisted upon us as prestige TV over the last 6, 7, 8 years. My go-to punching bag for this, and I apologize, it's not fair. I need more punching bags. But there was a show on Starz called Magic City that Mitch Glazer created. And it wasn't very good.
Jeffrey Dean Morgan was in that, right?
That's right. It looked good, but it was not very good. And it was a period crime show about Miami. And that's all it was about. It looked beautiful. It was about these characters, I guess. They weren't memorable, but it was in Miami, and it was sort of there. And all the stories would come from just being there. By the time you get to episode 6 of The Deuce, season 1, and there are 8 episodes, we realize this isn't about the sex trade in Times Square in the 70s. This is about the radical changing of the sex trade in America within a certain era. All of the pieces, you said it, all the pieces of the show do matter. And so for those of you who are caught up on the show, we now know that this whole season, all the little bits and pieces and dribs and drabs we've been getting are about the massive collusion from the mob and the cops and the government basically to profit off of sex work, to move it from the streets into buildings, to clean up Times Square, but more importantly, to continue to it's not legalize things quite, but it's to normalize them in order to make profit off of them. And it's about, this is what Simon and Pelecanos in his books and certainly in his TV work do well. It's about the end of things. Things used to be one way, now they're
it almost goes back to season 3 of The Wire, which was largely about quote unquote progress and the impossibility of progress. Well, we're seeing progress, and it's ugly. It doesn't feel good. But this was about, there had been some loosening I don't know if it was loosening, but there had been a shifting way we looked at morality and sexuality in the end of the 60s. And this is sort of the commodification of that to some extent. But yeah, it's fascinating to watch them basically take all these archetypes, take these people that in scripts and in descriptions of shows would be defined by what they do. So prostitute, pimp, cop, bartender, whatever, and slowly but surely get to the person underneath the job description in every single case. You know, whether it's Chris Bauer's construction worker or, you know, James Franco's bartender. It's just the way that they sort of chip away and start showing the humanity in these people is... we may not appreciate it while it's on. I know that we probably didn't with Treme. I know that, you know, Show Me a Hero had its admirers, but maybe not enough viewers. The same thing for Generation Kill. Simon is very, very good at taking a profession or a series of professions and showing how the people who do those jobs are more than they're just their professions.
I love the performances on this show. I love the characters on this show. I've fallen completely in love with them in 6 episodes. And I have to tell you, maybe this is a new experience. Maybe it's one that we should have more of in contemporary TV, which is I'm being greedy. I want much, much, much more.
Yeah.
I can't believe there are only 2 episodes of this left because I want to keep sinking into this world with these people as they navigate these changing terrain. Now, there's going to be a 2nd season, but that's already been confirmed, and likely a 3rd, although that has yet to be made official. But from what George told us when he was here, they're going to do a pretty significant time jump.
Yeah.
That this is a show about telling a story about America, of course, about a city, of course, through the lens of Times Square and these inflection points for when Times Square shifted. And so, if this season is what we've been talking about, of taking the sex trade from the streets into the buildings, the 2nd season will be in the 80s and about pornography moving to California, basically, which makes me wonder. Not everyone from the season is coming with us, I would imagine. I mean, if we're going to jump 10 years,
No, I would imagine not.
and I'm going to miss them.
Yeah.
First of all, I can only guess that the ones who don't make it with us to the 2nd season don't make it because they climbed multiple flights of stairs. Because that is the show's go-to. So far, 2 people have been shown wheezing on the stairs only to suffer massive cardiac events.
Yeah.
That's my only criticism of the show, honestly. It's like, these people...
There's a lot of death during oral sex, you know, just like a lot of horrific oral sex going on.
These people, you mean the rat also? Yeah. These people smoke so much.
I know.
Like, it makes me want to smoke because I feel weird having never done it. You could do an avant-garde
art piece that's just people from the Deuce and Mad Men smoking.
Do you think that Franco being kind of methody was just like, no, I'll just really smoke Marlboros, and now he has major health issues? Because there is not a scene where he is not smoking a cigarette. And sometimes he's playing 2 characters smoking in the same scene. He's literally hotboxing himself.
Can you imagine how the continuity, like who's the continuity guy who has to figure out like what length of cigarette he's smoking in each shot?
I just to say, like, we will come back to the show. I really, really, obviously we are pro Pelecanos. He's the thread running through this podcast, but there is so much of him in this show. And I think it helps. It helps the subject matter. It does keep... I've heard people say that, even despite the subject matter and a lot of the positive things we're saying, that this show still isn't quote unquote fun enough. And to that I say, like, are you watching the margins? The performances, like the guys who are playing the pimps.
Gary Carr, Method Man.
Gary Carr is incredible, British actor. Our man Chris Partlow from The Wire.
Yeah.
And then Method Man and Black Thought especially.
Yeah.
These guys are delightful, even as they do horrific things in the show. But this is the genius of Simon and Pelecanos. They are everything all at once. They can be monstrous, they can be tender, they can be just outright hilarious.
Yeah.
And one can feel, as the season builds to its finale, one can feel an enormous amount of sympathy for them because they're the ones getting, in many ways, the rug pulled out from under them because they are not necessary once the next steps are taken.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes when you talk about David Simon shows, it sounds like you're talking about jazz. It's
the worst talking about jazz.
It's really good for you, man. Like, you just don't understand the artistry underneath all of this. And
this scene when what's his name? Larry Gilliard, who plays the cop, Chris Olsen, takes the reporter to the jazz club, and he does the watching jazz face, where he leans his head back and he goes, because the bass is hitting him.
Do you think it's because we're so like self-aware about The Wire after the fact and about the sort of pleasures of The Wire that we it almost feels weird talking about another show in that way, in that sort of reverence. I think The Wire had a certain propulsiveness that has been probably intentionally taken out of what Simon's done since then. You know what I mean? There wasn't the same kind of, at the end of the day, they were still chasing someone. I mean, that's sort of how 3 ends, with just like, who have I been chasing this whole time, you know, with Stringer. But I do think that there is almost like you make a great album and then all of a sudden you just like, you're like, you know what, we're not going to use electric guitars anymore.
Right. To challenge yourself.
Yeah.
You've done that already.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just particularly sweet on the show, but I think that he has done enough projects since The Wire that he feels, he's like comfortable playing the hits again a little bit.
A little bit, yeah. The sense of humor that's in this show, and I think a lot of it has to do with the casting, but the sense of humor that's in this show is pretty funny. Yeah. And that's hard to say because of what happens to people in the show. You feel weird being like, I laugh like multiple times during every episode of The Deuce.
That's the best kind of TV show. Yeah. And I think it's the cast, but I also think it's Richard Price continuing to write for the show, who has a very particular biting kind of world-weary humor that is shot through this. And I mean, probably also the writers who were added to the mix, Megan Abbott, Lisa Lutz, who've written
Lisa Lutz
episodes.
wrote the Chinese food scene, right? She has the scene where the cops buy the prostitutes Chinese food.
I think George told us that. I think that was a Price episode, but that she may have contributed to that scene.
Well, in any case, that's like one of those scenes where you're watching it and you're just like, this is priceless, like, not to put too fine a point on it. You're like, this is just amazing stuff. But almost in retrospect, you're like, oh yeah, and this was kind of how I felt about certain scenes in The Wire.
Right.
And
look, the thing that is
which is like, I almost sound like I'm not thankful for it. You know what I mean?
The biggest problem with quote unquote prestige TV with the hour-long drama was this I'm not a bad man problem, right? Where it was this idea that, you know, I'm not one thing, I'm not the other thing, I'm both. Well, if you have to say it, you're neither, you're nothing. You're not good at making the story, quite frankly, or at articulating this anymore. Because you look at what these guys do effortlessly, which is present something that isn't reality, but is shot through with enough experience and lived-in experience and care and empathy that when you see the pimps and Chris Alston, the cop, played by Larry Gilliard, at the barbershop or at Leon's, at the cafe, these neutral places, and they are talking like people who've known each other for years because they have. You're not thinking about powerful or impassioned bathroom mirror monologues. You're just thinking about how life works. Yeah. And that's the brilliance of this show.
Andy, I want to get to Sweet Forever, but first let's just take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Today's episode of The Watch is brought to you by LinkedIn. Greenwald, have you tried to hire someone lately?
Yeah, I have an active listing at the moment.
What's that for?
Podcast co-host.
Oh, you're the best one in the business. It's a hard thing to do, listing jobs. You post to job boards and you hope you'll find the right person for your job, but think about it. How often do you check job boards? For most people, it's a pretty occasional thing, but there is a place where people go daily to grow professionally and explore job opportunities. In fact, 70% of the U.S. workforce is there. LinkedIn, son. You already know LinkedIn as the world's largest professional network. Well, it's also a better way to find great talent. Just ask any of the hundreds of thousands of businesses who have posted LinkedIn jobs over the past year. 22 million professionals view and apply to jobs on LinkedIn every week. And because LinkedIn considers skills, experiences, location, and more to match and promote your job to potential candidates, businesses rate LinkedIn jobs 40% higher than job boards at delivering quality candidates. A business is only as strong as its people, and every hire matters. So don't settle for posting and hoping the right person will find your role and apply. Go to linkedin.com/thewatch and get a $50 credit towards your first job post. That's LinkedIn/thewatch. LinkedIn.com/thewatch for a $50 credit today. Terms and conditions apply.
If I had used LinkedIn, I wouldn't have lost Katie Nolan to ESPN.
Today's episode of The Watch is also brought to you by Stitch Fix Men. You can tell a guy who's got style, he always looks great and seems confident, like he's ready for anything. Well, that takes a certain skill set that not all of us were born with. But now there's an easy way to look better. Let me tell you about Stitch Fix Men. Stitch Fix is the new way to shop for clothes, and it's unbelievably simple. Just go to stitchfix.com and answer some questions about your sizes, what styles you like, and how much you want to spend. Stitch Fix has clothes for every guy and his style. It's not just one type of look. Your personal stylist uses your preferences and then all the other information you enter to select brand new clothes just for you. The items are delivered right to your home. You try them on and you only pay for what you keep. Just send anything you don't want back. Shipping is free both ways. Get your fix on demand or sign up to receive scheduled shipments. Guys of all shapes, sizes, and budgets agree. Defining your style starts with Stitch Fix. Try them today. You've got nothing to lose. Get started now at stitchfix.com/watch, and you'll also get 25% off when you keep all 5 items in your box. That's stitchfix.com/watch to get started today. stitchfix.com/watch. All right, Andy, we're back, and it's book club time. Double Down Book Club.
We're back.
The Streets Book Club. This time we did George Pelecanos' The Sweet Forever.
Chris, it's funny that we've had this book club for a couple iterations now, and we had yet to do one of the founding sacred texts of the idea for a book club, and in fact for a large chunk of our friendship, which is this author and this book. So, if I may, just by way into this book was published in 1998. It is Pelecanos' probably 5th or 6th book at this point,
and the second in the DC Quartet.
The second in a series of books that came to be known as the DC Quartet. 3 of which follow Marcus Clay and Dimitri Karas through 3 decades of life: 70s, King Suckerman; the 80s, Sweet Forever; and the 90s, Shame the Devil. And there's also the Big Blowdown, which tells sort of an origin story for Karas, his father's story in the 40s and 50s.
Right. And King Suckerman has, I'm a big fan of that book.
Yeah.
King Suckerman is basically a crime novel version of a 70s like crime novel, like almost like a blaxploitation movie or a like trashy French Connection movie. It has like a real like 70s and flashing lights thing happening in the way that the Sweet Forever doesn't quite have. The 80s in Sweet Forever is more deeply ingrained into the characters and the story.
One of the interesting things about being a fan of George Pelecanos for a long time and reading all of his books is you see, and this is actually the case with all great writers, especially prolific writers, you see them change as people. Their interests change, not just their talent level or their comfort, but who they are and what they value. And his first 3 books are enormously important to us.
Yes.
And they're A Firing Offense, Nick's Trip, and Down by the River Where the Dead Men Go, the Nick Stefanos trilogy. Nick Stefanos shows up in Sweet Forever as a secondary character, sort of in between those books or just before those books start.
The best way to describe
he's
those
in
books,
King Suckerman too.
And the best way to describe those early books is like basically punk rock Raymond Chandler.
Yeah,
his first-person detective novels that involve a guy whose life is coming apart while he listens to the Replacements and does push-ups.
It sweats
and
out.
Solves crimes.
Sweats out the whiskey.
Yeah.
By the time we got to the Sweet Forever, and Sweet Forever was the first Pelecanos book I read, and so I'm psyched for anyone out there. This was the first book they've read. This was, to my mind, where he turned the corner from being the punk rock Chandler to being a much more, and I mean this without any shade, I mean this quite complimentarily, to be much more socially responsible in a way, to broaden the palette. It's no longer a first-person book. We go in the heads of multiple characters on multiple levels of society, not unlike The Wire. David Simon would then hire Pelecanos to work on The Wire 5 or 6 years after this book was published, largely off of this book. This is the book that Simon's wife, the crime writer Laura Lippman, handed to David Simon and said, you should hire this guy for your show.
Yeah, and there's actually a great tradition of crime novels as social histories. Just off the top of my head, you've got the James Ellroy LA novels that jump out immediately. And then there's also, if you haven't checked these out, the David Peace Red Riding books, which are about a series of murders that took place in northern England in the late 70s and early 80s. And each of the books are called 1977, 1980, and they are phenomenal. They made them into a series of, I think it was like two movies maybe. I can't remember how they did the movies, but Andrew Garfield was in it. I believe Rebecca Hall was in it. They did a good job with the movie, but the books are extraordinary. This idea basically that a crime story can tell the story of a community or a region or a city or a time is not something that, that's not something that Dashiell Hammett was doing. You can extrapolate ideas from Chandler and Hammett about the time those books were written in, but they weren't explicitly trying to tell the story of an era the way some of these other writers eventually took that upon themselves.
I think this is Pelecanos at the height of his powers because he is synthesizing the 2 strains of writer that he is. I love that you said punk rock Chandler, that's in it, but then also the sort of social scientist that he became, or social observer anyway, later in his career. What this book has is it's probably his most intricately and impressively plotted because it's set around the NCAA tournament opening weekend in 1986. The shadow of Len Bias and the impact he had on the community, both in life and death, bookends the book. But what this book also does, with just especially noticing this on the third read, just relentless pace and structure.
Yeah,
over 3 days. But what he does in this, and this has fallen away in his later books, and I don't know if this is because he's getting leaner, in his prose, which is very possible, or he's pulled in 100 directions, which is also possible because he's making television shows like The Deuce. But this book has just an overflowing amount of tiny, beautiful, specific detail and grace notes given to even the smallest characters in life and death. He writes death, and this is also why David Simon ended up giving, I think, every penultimate episode of The Wire to Pelecanos.
Dr. Death, yeah.
His first episode was Where's Wallace? Because of the way characters are dispatched in this book with dignity, but also with real agony. I mean, both for the reader and for the character.
They're shattering, yeah.
And there are these little moments in this book. Obviously, I'm going to mention, and we're going to talk to House about this, like the hot dogs from Ben's Chili Bowl, and but the action figure in the little kid's hand who gets gunned down by Short Man. The smell, the way Marcus Clay describes the smell of his sleeping 3-year-old son's head. It's really breathtaking.
Yeah,
Pelecanos has always been an incredibly visceral read for me, and I think for you, for a lot of people, because of his attention to ritual. He is a car freak, which I'm not, but he makes driving American cars sound awesome. This book obviously has a lot of ritual because there's a lot of drug ritual, and there's even a line when Dimitri Kara says he loved anything that had a ritual attached to it, and it's whether it's setting up lines of cocaine or pouring a
very specific amount of alcohol,
brandy into a glass. And he was a bartender himself, and his characters have been too. But the language of shaking a Newport from the deck, of 5 dead soldiers lined up in front of him.
It's so tactile. Like this entire book, there are things like you said, like the smell of the child's head. There's something about I think there's a night where Dimitri just basically rocks out in Marcus's record store to Husker Du records all night, and it's
in his apartment in the Trauma Arms.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And then the plaster that's getting shaken loose because of his dancing and stuff like that.
And then we turn the camera to Marcus on the street, seeing him listening to the Pogues.
Yeah.
And it's a classic buddy moment.
But the rhythm that you're talking about is something that just jumps out on a reread. You can't believe, I think he takes this from Elmore Leonard, who's also, doesn't matter how long an Elmore Leonard book is, it's a one sitter. You could just sit down and be done with Rum Punch or whatever in one sitting, because there is a certain understanding of just the right moment to maybe throw a little bit more in there, but knows how to get out of the way of the story and the characters and just let them go about their lives. And people talk about writers in this sort of magical, the characters are just speaking through me. I don't know. But you read these books and you kind of feel like these are guys that Pelecanos quote unquote knows, and he knows what they do with every waking and sleeping hour of their day.
And what they value.
And so that as they go through their life, the story is told in conversation and action, not in narration.
Yes. And one last note, we're going to bring in Joe House in a minute to talk about this and about the world. But what I was really struck by was my changing relationship to the book. And when we had George Pelecanos on the podcast recently, I think we finally fessed up about the time we went to a book signing, and we basically tried to training day him out of the out of the Barnes and Noble in Chelsea or wherever it was. And he was like,
that does not mean we asked him if he gets wet.
No, but we were close. And he was like, I'm going to have one Heineken and go to sleep.
Yeah, right.
When I first read these books, when we were younger in different phases of our life, I was devouring, dare I say, hoovering up the Dimitri stuff, and the going to concerts and just getting messed up and everything about the high life, literally, as he presents here, and that's all shot through the Stefanos books too. Reading it this time, I was totally slayed, and I'm sorry, this is pure dadcore here, but I was totally slayed by the Marcus stuff, being estranged from his son, about Clarence Tate worried about his daughter.
Yeah.
There is something in here, quite frankly, for people of different ages in life, and it's fascinating now to read this. Obviously, this book was always...
I think Pelecanos... I would be really curious to know what he thinks. I feel bad that we didn't ask him about this, because even the hangovers in this book are magical
and super specific.
And when you actually are hung over and drinking terrible coffee and it feels like your brain is going to fall out of your ear and you're going to throw up at the same time, that's not a great feeling. But when this happens in this book, you're sitting among piles of records with your best friend, busting each other's balls. You're kind of like, yes, this is the best.
There's a moment when Dimitri makes soup for Marcus with an old ham bone he has in the freezer, and I'm like, this is something that someone has done. This is lived in. It's interesting. The times that we've talked to him, he's very proud of this book, obviously, and the series and the other books that he wrote in the 90s and early part of the 2000s, but he very quickly says he could not write those books now. And there is some serious distance, both in who he is, where he is in his life, but also, and he told us this recently, and this is a good a segue as any into our conversation with House.
Well, I wanted to, I guess we could ask House this, but I did have one more question for you.
Well, I was just going to say that Pelecanos feels like the city is different.
That's true. Well, that's actually a great way. I'll bring this up with House. So let's go to Joe, and let's talk to him about Sweet Forever. Joe, we wanted to have you on to talk about Sweet Forever because we just thought reading is fundamental. It's time to get you back in the literary game. But also, obviously, you're like you're one of the great voices of Washington, D.C. culture. You're almost something of a social historian yourself. Whenever I talk to you, I just feel like I'm getting such a lesson in the ways of D.C.
As far as I'm concerned, there's Jim Vance and then there's Joe House, and that's it.
But Joe, what were some of the feelings you had reading this book?
Well, the very first feeling I had is I don't know how anyone that's not from Washington can make any sense out of this book because it is so hyper-specific in all of the places and the restaurants and the music venues and the porn theaters and the neighborhoods. They're so sort of hyper-specific. I have in my mind's eye, I was able to experience this book in a way that it feels like a shame that other consumers of it who didn't grow up in the Washington, D.C. area at that time could enjoy it. It was kind of mind-blowing because it walked me right through. I mean, that was my teenage years. So.
Well, paint us that picture then, because I think that one of the things that is compelling about the book, separate and apart from the story and the plot, is just it was kind of a document of an era of 1980s DC when it was written in 1998, but it is even more of a time capsule now because the book is set, I think, on this sort of risky new branch of Real Right Records that is being opened on U. Right, and the U Street corridor is now, or has been for 10 years, right, sort of the ground zero of the gentrification or hipsterization of downtown DC. So can you talk us through the geography of where is this book set? What was that like for you in your life at the time versus this world today?
Yeah, so U Street is an important part of the DC fabric, the DC history. It was historically a focal point for the African-American arts community. The Lincoln Theater is there. It's proximate to Howard University. The Howard University Theater is in the general vicinity there. From basically like New York Avenue to Florida Avenue to 7th Street all the way up to 18th Street, and U Street kind of bisects all of those neighborhoods. LaDroit, Bloomington, Georgia Avenue is in there as well. That quadrant, and I'll call it like, I don't know, 15 square blocks or so, was in the 60s and even before that, a real focal point, like I said, for the African-American arts community and specifically the jazz community in Washington, D.C. In connection with the Martin Luther King assassination, that part of the city burned. And it took 30-some-odd years for that portion of the city to be restored. One of the big engines behind restoring that portion of the city, and it's referenced in the book, was the arrival of the subway. In Washington, D.C., it's called the Metro. And so they put a metro station in the vicinity of like 10th and U, maybe a little closer to 11th and U. In fact, there are a couple stops now I'm thinking about it. But Green Line stops along U Street. And the construction in the mid-'80s there had the effect of, enticing business back into that area because it never really did recover after the riots in the late 60s. So for 20 years, up until that mid-'80s period, it was kind of blighted. But the arrival of the metro did have a positive effect in luring people back into that area. Still slow going, though. It's like picturing it in your mind's eye. It's low row houses. It's block after block of low row houses, 3-story, 4-story row houses, but they don't go up very high. And it's got a little bit of a feel, I guess, like Brooklyn, but it's a lot denser than Brooklyn. And so for this time period, the way when this book was set, the way it looked then, because of the construction, it was very much like, I don't know, I don't want to call it a war zone, but you're constantly navigating equipment. You're constantly navigating, it's dirty down there. There isn't a lot of commerce down there. And at that time, none of the gentrification, Andy, that you mentioned of the last dozen years or so, was way off in the future. The mainstay down there, as always, is the famous Ben's Chili Bowl, which has been there for 45 years or so, serving half smokes.
Plays an integral role in this book. Because
yes.
People keep taking this kid there. And it's a wonder he agrees to go down to visit his family in South Carolina or wherever he's sent off to save him because he's eating so well.
He forfeited Ben's. That trade-off was, probably saved his life down in Georgia going fishing, but he had to give up Ben's for it.
One side note for people who enjoyed reading this book, another Pelecanos book, Hard Revolution, is specifically about the riots and about that neighborhood burning, basically. He takes a character that was from the next series of books he did, Derek Strange, and wrote about him in his youth. So if anything House is saying that sparks interest, that's a book to read.
Joe, you paint a pretty vivid picture there of this idea that, and I think probably anybody who's grew up in a big East Coast city went through some extended period of construction on a major part of the city where you're like, you're not really going to dig this up, are you? And then they do, and you're like, nobody can get around this city now, right?
Or the Philadelphia version. You're not really going to drop a bomb on your own city, are you?
Yeah, right, seriously. But another thing plays a huge role it's in the background and in the foreground of Sweet Forever is the rise of cocaine in the city. And I was wondering, I'm a little young to remember that period clearly, but I was wondering if you remember just how big of an impact it had on the city then.
So it had an enormous impact on the city, and it was the headlines of the Washington Post and the Washington Star at that time nearly daily because the gangs that rose concurrent with the rise of crack cocaine especially led to D.C. becoming the so-called homicide capital of the world, and that was that time period. Now, at that point, the city was very segregated, still very segregated. So I was a teenager, and while it was chilling to read the tales of these drug wars and the gang wars that were going on, it wasn't proximate to my life. And you guys know, I grew up in the independent music scene in the Washington, D.C. area. I was lucky to have that there, and that had the effect of bringing me downtown to portions of town that were probably, in retrospect, not the safest places to be going, at kind of random times. But even in those expeditions, you never really came up that close to, the sort of turf war that was going on in the city. Yeah,
even the vocabulary words that you're using while describing it, it brings me back to just the vernacular of the war on drugs and the militarized aspect of that, and the idea that, and like a lot of wars were happening it felt like off away from you, but it was a constant presence in local media and in national media back then in terms of just the idea of how much it was influencing city politics, voting patterns, all this stuff, and obviously destroying millions of people's lives in the process.
For sure. Go ahead, Andy.
One of the things that Pelecanos does so well is he evokes, the potential for cities to bring people from disparate backgrounds together, and there's a very broad array of races and classes and ethnicities brought together in this book. And one thing that I'm struck by that is relevant to the conversation you were just having about growing up with this vibrant music culture is that there were it's not just there was one vibrant independent music scene that I'm thinking of. It's not like just an indie rock scene. There was a vibrant black music scene, underground black music scene there that is incredibly specific to DC. Go-go music,
Right.
EU and Trouble Funk is happening concurrently with Discord Records, with Scream, and even Tommy Keene gets to show up on stage here. The great underappreciated Tommy Keene.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, you had all these overlapping, interlocking music scenes, and I hate to put rose-tinted glasses on, but because there was not a social media infrastructure to allow you to access this stuff whenever you wanted, there was a degree. The impetus is on you to go seek it out. And once you got the bug, it wasn't really a choice. Once you got that first 7-inch record and you got indoctrinated into a subculture, you were kind of like, this is my life now, and this is what I do.
Can you talk to us about specifically like your journeys downtown and what that was like for you as a music fan and just as a young person living in such a specific city in such a specific era?
Yeah, and it's funny that you guys mention. I'm glad that you connected go-go and that sort of all by itself its own independent music scene, because there was a real overlap between the punk scene and the funk scene. I mean, there were shows that were punk and funk where Trouble Funk played with somebody out of the hardcore scene. I think there was a Trouble Funk Minor Threat show. There might be
That's amazing.
A poster for. But the interesting thing that ties them together, and I think that Brother George really captured, DC in that era was really a working class town, and with working class folks, out in the suburbs, maybe coming into the city for government jobs. But at that point in DC's life history, the money that's there now was not present. So the thing that sort of tied those two music scenes together was just kids looking for an outlet to kind of enjoy their own thing. And it is highly unique now that I'm in my 40s to have these two scenes arising at simultaneously, serving the two communities that were present there in the DC area. On the one hand, African American community, and then the white kind of suburban community as well. But they were both kind of open to each other, is the way I would say it. And the venues that you would go see, like Rare Essence or Trouble Funk or EU, same venues hosting the punk rock shows.
As you were talking, I pulled up a flyer from a show, a DC Funk Punk Spectacular at Landsberg's Cultural Center. It says, in the heart of the downtown district, Friday, September 23rd. I'm curious if you could put the year on it, but it's Trouble Funk headlining with Minor Threat, and then from Austin, Texas, the Big Boys. Plus the special scratch rap team, New York and the Static Disruptor, with All Night Disco by Soundtech Productions, beer and wine all night, $5.
Joe, was this stuff was there any oversight to any of these shows, or was it pretty much like self-starters?
Self-starters and self-policed. It is, I don't know that it's necessarily incredible that there wasn't, trouble amongst the kids, but there wasn't really trouble amongst the kids that I recall from my experience of it. Now, I did experience it. Andy, to answer your question, my guess is that was a 1982 or 83 show. I'm going to go with 83.
Mm-hmm.
What year was it?
No, it doesn't say.
We're literally asking.
Yeah.
I thought I was going to guess the answer.
I think you may have, but I don't know for sure.
That preceded me by a little bit. My era was like 85.
It's 83.
It's 83.
You nailed it.
Yeah, I mean that had to be it. Minor Threat is the tell for that.
You could get advance tickets at the Joe's Record Paradise in Rockville.
Oh my God!
Or the RTX Arlington, Kent Mill, Georgetown. It was a Blush dog bite production, which, by the way, unbelievable.
Joe, if you and I have a holy trinity, it's music, food, and sports, and the sports play a huge role in this book as well. And I just feel like I just kind of want to clear out and let you play iso ball here and talk a little bit. Because I think you can read about Len Bias in Sweet Forever, but you don't really understand just what a huge figure he was in DC back then.
So what's curious about this is, and I wonder if George is revealing a slight bias, not to use bias two different ways, but Georgetown at this point in time was a big effing thing. Georgetown was humongous in Washington and humongous in the communities where this book takes place, especially down there in that sort of Shaw, Howard University kind of area. So the bias towards bias, I think, really speaks to, and I'd love to have the opportunity to hear George talk about this a little bit. His center of gravity is Silver Spring, and that's my center of gravity as well. And then bias was incredibly important to me as a kid, but I wasn't in a position to have an idea as to how broad his appeal was across the D.C. area. I just know from my time as a teenager and then going beyond it, the impact that his death had on the entire community, and the stories that I've been able to sort of tell with people that I've met beyond that time. He was incredibly important to the community because of, and there's a line in this book, from Northwestern High School in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is not that far away from the University of Maryland campus, to the Boston Celtics. That was a real kind of magic trajectory for our area, right? I mean, Patrick Ewing was an outsider. He came from Massachusetts down to D.C. and then went on to stardom. He wasn't born and raised in the DMV. Len was our guy, and I know that to be true for me personally. I mean, I know that morning, the book ends with the bias overdose. I know exactly where I was that morning. I know exactly the condition that I was in, which was hungover. I had snuck out that night. Sorry, Mom and Dad. And I just couldn't. I was speechless.
How did you hear about it?
Speak. My mom told me.
Oh man.
Yeah. At like 10:30 in the morning when I finally got out of bed that day.
Yeah, I mean, in the same way that the music had a certain like mythology, it was like a local product enjoyed by local people, and it was very regional and in some way very cloistered off. Basketball players had that too. I mean, it's a slightly later version of this, but I remember when Rasheed Wallace was at Simon Gratz on their 30-0 team, and they played in the city finals, and it was like, this kid's going to UNC. This is going to be amazing. Like Rasheed Wallace is going to go out and rep Philly high school basketball in the ACC. This is great. And, of course, he went on to have the career he had. There were other guys, I mean, like...
And he brought Philly to the world with his
he brought Philadelphia to the
with
world.
his positive attitude on the court every night.
But the same idea that you would go see Minor Threat, or you would go see Trouble Funk, or you would go see these local legends in basketball, there was something that was very shared because... you didn't have a lot. There wasn't that influx of culture coming from every other part of the world that you wanted it from then. So you had to make the most with what you had. And if you had somebody like Len Bias, you had a lot.
It was at a moment when we could have that earnestness and that sort of, now it looks quaint, that sincerity. Like local product really meant something in that era. A point of pride.
What obviously Pelecanos is, he doesn't need to prove his DC bona fides to us or to you, but I'm curious, reading it, aside from Ben's Chili Bowl and the references to Tacoma and the District Line and all the stuff that is just... It's, by the way, to go back to what you said at the beginning, one of the reasons why I love reading his books is because his DC is like Narnia to me. I've learned more about DC and I've visited since, and now I can make more sense of it geographically, but when these areas begin to come up over and over again, they create their own sort of mythology in the novice reader. So when you mention Prince George's County, I'm like, okay, well, I have a sense of it from the role that it plays in his books, and that's kind of fun. Although I agree that it would be better to actually have that deep set knowledge. But to go back to my question, other than the food and the references to Georgetown and et cetera, what did you find to be the most DC aspect of the book, and what was it that was pure DC to you?
Oh my gosh, that's a hard question.
It is. It's a broad question. I guess what I'm fishing for is something about the tone.
Rife.
Yeah,
the book is so rife. Honestly, and I don't know what it says about me that it resonated the way it did. The reference to the porn theaters was such a throwback. It was such a specific time. Like they were there and then they were gone. Like, the idea of a theater where men would go and where those theaters existed, the theater in Georgetown that continuously showed Caligula, perpetually Caligula.
Perpetually Caligula is the name of my first album, actually. It's out of print.
It's so weird upon reflection, and that was the reaction I had. Really, like, oh my, the Gaiety Theater, Casino Royale, the Caligula place in Georgetown. What? This brother is going deep. I mean, those are places that existed in that era, but they might as well have disappeared in 1987. For all of the impact they had in the community.
But that's kind of the amazing thing about this book and about the genre in general, which is something we're always trying to connect the dots from, like getting people to read this one book to appreciating crime fiction in general. It is a preserved and amber snapshot of an era that is completely gone, as you said. This is obviously a work of fiction, but there were people like this, and there were people like this in Pelecanos' life, and probably people that maybe you intersected with at different stages of your life, living a certain way at a certain time that would otherwise just be forgotten or bulldozed by history, or bulldozed like whatever buildings were bulldozed to build the metro that led to there being an American Apparel in the U Street corridor in 2006, or whatever it was, right? I mean, it still exists and reaches a new audience and a new level of significance because of it.
What I especially appreciate on that note is the socioeconomic sort of feel of this, because that more than anything is my recollection of that era in D.C. It was working class people. It was the rise of the I don't know what you call it, the K Street class, the lobbying class that exists now, and how Washington has become, this engine for folks to make a lot of money by consulting, on matters that involve the federal government. None of that really existed in this way, shape, or form. The mega status of the law firms in Washington, that was all that all came in an era after this time. And one of the things that also struck me as I was thinking about this was a time when there weren't a lot of people out on the streets.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of foot traffic back in this era, and there were a lot less people in general living in the city. And so, the authenticity of, how you the characters would recognize, that's the kid that stands, Anthony Taylor. That's the kid that stands on the corner in front of that liquor store. Like, that would be a known thing to those people from that neighborhood, the inhabitants of that neighborhood, because of the commonality of their experience the consistency of their experience, not commonality, because they're not seeing a lot of other people. And the funny thing about this record store every single day, the one on U Street, any sales? Nope. Because there ain't nobody walking down the street there to go buy records.
Yeah, man, but my favorite thing about this, and this is also kind of a very romantic vision of living in a city, because there's plenty of things about living in cities that are tough, but for the most part, people have small apartments. They sometimes live with roommates or whatever, but they have like these small places. Got mice, got roaches, got whatever you've got. The heater doesn't work. But the thing about a city that's cool is that the city can be your apartment, and then you find a bar, and that bar is better than your living room. And you go to the same movie theater over and over again because that's better than the TV screen you have. And you go to the record store that you go to all the time because that's got the best stereo that you could ever hope to have, is just to like wander around the stacks there. A lot of that stuff has kind of disappeared from life because I've gotten older or whatever, but that's the thing that resonates the most for me in this book, outside of it being DC, is that idea that you can use a city as the extended canvas of your life. And it's something that he captures really, really well about how people build up as rich of a life as possible even when they're short on funds.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the essence of, again, that to me that strikes to the heart of what I'm trying to describe as this working class kind of thing, where you're a known entity at the bar that you frequent because you frequent it with some frequency. It is your living room outside of the living room in the place that you inhabit, and the same thing as kind of the restaurants that are mentioned, and the guy Bobby at Pied Al Cochon, the bartender Bobby, who knows exactly what Dimitri's in for and pours the perfect Grand Marnier. That's an experience that feels like it belongs to a long gone era.
I'm going to put you on the spot in a very unfair way before we let you go.
Nice.
house. We obviously music plays a huge role in this book. A listener to the podcast made a massive playlist that we will tweet out again of either every song or band mentioned in this book, and there are plenty. But you heard us right before we started recording, just going through like the NME list of best albums and tracks from 1986, which was just a wildly good year. I mean, albums alone, you have Paul Simon's Graceland, Run DMC, Raising Hell, REM, Life's Rich Pageant, The Smiths' Queen is Dead, The Beastie Boys, Husker Du, on and on and on.
Sonic Youth, yeah.
Sonic Youth.
Metallica, Slayer.
Goodness gracious.
And in this book, Pelecanos has his character, who in this case it's probably really him, Dimitri Karas, say, this year will always be the Pretenders, just like this previous year was always whatever he says. For you, 1986, who you got? If all those names we mentioned are something else, or even something that came out in 85 that you discovered, is there a sound of 86 for you?
So for me, the power of this band that I'm going to mention, there's two bands I'm going to mention. They're super, DC. Although one of them, I think both of you guys know Rites of Spring.
Of course.
Yeah.
So their seminal record came out in 1986. Like that was, they're mind-blowing to this day, yet still most important, a crucial deliverable out of the DC indie scene.
The inventors of emo, of course.
Deeper
we know
than
them.
inside.
I reject that, but
I got a book for you.
Yeah, the other band, and again, this is like the experience of it was Dag Nasty, which is just like a local. It's funny they're touring again, but a local band with a prominent guitarist, Brian Baker, who was part of Minor Threat, a quartet that was fronted by an African American kid named Sean Brown, and then was replaced by Dave Smalley in that very time period, that 85, 86 time period. And I experienced that band with both lead singers. Always preferred Sean Brown, and I'm happy the iteration now is still fronted by Sean Brown. But those shows were blows to the chest. Like I can kind of replicate the feeling. I can imagine the feeling of it now. Still, being sort of physically assaulted by attending those shows.
Joe, thanks so much for joining us, man. You really added an extra layer of character to this whole discussion about the Sweet Forever. Really appreciate it.
Fellas, we could do this for hours and hours and hours, but I'm glad we kept it to the 20 minutes that we did.
Thanks, brother.
Join us for
Love
Grand
you guys.
Marnier shot soon.
You got it.
Okay, guys, we are so thankful to Joe House for joining us to talk about Sweet Forever.
Thank you to everyone for making our dreams come true by reading one of our favorite books with us, Sweet Forever by George Pelecanos.
We'll tweet out that playlist. We'll announce our new book later coming up. And then on Monday, I just expect more TV coverage, the kind of TV coverage you rely on me and Andy for.
We are back. We got Curb Your Enthusiasm to catch up on. We've got The Good Place. We've got more Mindhunter.
More Mindhunter.
So we're back, man. We're going to be on our couches all weekend doing the good Lord's work.
See you Monday.
That sounds weird. Sorry, Baranskis.
Today's episode of The Watch was brought to you by LinkedIn. The best place to find great talent for your hiring needs is LinkedIn. Businesses rate LinkedIn 40% higher than job boards at delivering quality candidates. Go to linkedin.com/thewatch for a $50 credit towards your first job post. LinkedIn.com/thewatch. Terms and conditions apply. Today's episode of The Watch was also brought to you by Stitch Fix Men. You can tell a guy who's got style. He always looks great and seems confident, like he's ready for anything. Well, that takes a certain skill set that not all of us were born with. But now there's an easy way to look better. Let me tell you about Stitch Fix Men. Stitch Fix is the new way to shop for clothes, and it is unbelievably simple. Just go to stitchfix.com and answer some questions about your sizes, what styles you like, and how much you want to spend. Stitch Fix has clothes for every guy in his style. It's not just one type of look. Your personal stylist then uses your preferences and other information that you enter to select brand new clothes just for you. The items are delivered right to your home. You try them on, and you only pay for what you keep. Just send anything you don't want back. Shipping is free both ways. Get your Stitch Fix on demand or sign up to receive scheduled shipments. Guys of all shapes, sizes, and budgets agree. Defining your new style starts with Stitch Fix. Try them out today. You've got nothing to lose. Get started now at stitchfix.com/watch, and you'll also get 25% off when you keep all 5 items in your box. That's a good incentive. That's stitchfix.com/watch to get started today. stitchfix.com/watch.